Ephesians 5, verse 19. I'm reading from the ESV. Addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart.
Good evening. Tonight we continue our series on worship matters by looking at the peculiar practice of a cappella singing. Many times the churches of Christ are identified by the fact that they don't use the instrument in worship. Many times that's how people identify us, or that's our signature, I guess you could say, by some people's standards. They say, oh, you're Church of Christ, so y'all are the ones that don't believe in instruments. And of course, we do believe in instruments. We have children that are in the band. We may play the piano as a hobby or another instrument. We certainly believe in instruments. We've seen them. We know that they exist. We just obviously don't believe in instituting them in our worship. You know, the fact that churches of Christ have long had the standard of singing a cappella without the instrument has made us peculiar, but you may or may not know that we are not the only ones who practice a cappella singing in worship. The Greek Orthodox Church does not use the instrument, nor does the Primitive Baptist Church. And even temple worship by the Jews after the destruction of the temple was a cappella, although some have wavered on that a little bit in recent years. And really, even among denominations, we didn't used to be so peculiar in their eyes. History confirms that we have not always been the peculiar ones. John Calvin, often called the father of Presbyterianism, vehemently opposed the use of mechanical instruments in worship. In fact, he once stated, "We may not adopt any device which seems fit to ourselves, but look to the injunctions of him who alone is entitled to prescribe. Therefore, if we would have him to approve our worship, this rule, which he everywhere enforced with utmost strictness, must be fully observed. The Lord, in condemning and prohibiting fictitious worship, requires us to give obedience only to his own voice." John Knox, Scottish reformer who established Presbyterianism in Scotland, concurred with Calvin, and he taught that worship is prescribed by the precepts and examples of the New Testament. He believed in biblical simplicity without humanly devised rituals. Knox left a legacy of exclusive vocal singing in the Scottish Reformed churches that continues on in this day. Adam Clarke, a well-respected Methodist theologian, commented like this. He says, "I am an old man, and I here declare that I never knew them," meaning instruments, "to be productive of any good in the worship of God, and have reason to believe that they are productive of much evil. Music as a science I esteem and admire, but instrumental music in the house of God I abominate and abhor. This is the abuse of music, and I here register my protest against all such corruption of the worship of the author of Christianity." It was also Clarke who stated this concerning John Wesley, the founder of Methodism. He says, "The late and venerable and most eminent divine, the Reverend John Wesley, who was a lover of music and an elegant poet, when asked his opinion of instruments of music being introduced into the chapels of the Methodists, said in this terse and powerful manner, 'I have no objections to instruments of music in our chapels, provided that they are neither heard nor seen.'" Adam Clarke says, "I say the same." Charles Spurgeon was a British Baptist reformer who is often referred to as the greatest Baptist preacher of all time. He too was opposed to the instrument in worship. It was Spurgeon commenting on Psalm 42 who stated this. He said, "David appears to have had a peculiarly tender remembrance of the singing of the pilgrims, and assuredly it is the most delightful part of worship and that which comes nearest to the adoration of heaven. What a degradation to supplant the intelligent song of the whole congregation by the theatrical prettiness of a quartet, billows, and pipes. We might as well pray by machinery as praise by it. Praise the Lord with harp," he quotes. "Israel was at school and used childish things to help her to learn. But in these days when Jesus gives us spiritual food, one can make melody without strings and pipes. We do not need them. That would hinder rather than help our praise. Sing unto him. This is the sweetest and best music. No instrument is like the human voice, he says. Here we have scholars, we have leaders, we have reformers, we have founders of certain religions that all employ the musical instrument today, but these leaders, these scholars, these founders were vehemently opposed. I wonder if the folks in these congregations that are employing the instrument understand what their leaders, their founders believed. Because I don't believe you should follow any man unless it's Jesus Christ, but if you're going to follow a man, you'd think you'd at least listen to what he had to say and abide by his teachings. But it seems even on this issue, we pick and choose what we like and discard the rest. You know, many people ask, how did we arrive at this point, or how did we get to the point to where the instrument is so prevalent, and now the ones who don't use it and who hold to a strict teaching of a cappella singing are now the odd ones? How did that happen? Well, my friends, there are many different notions or theories that have been offered in this subject, but the bottom line is somebody wanted to use them, and that's really all it boils down to. The reason why you have instruments in different churches today is because somebody wanted them. There is no biblical authority for them. Chandler read a moment ago from Ephesians 5:19. The one another passage about singing to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, and we'll talk about the word solo later. But there's other evidence besides just Ephesians 5:19. There's extra biblical evidence from extra biblical writers, and we also know that the first church, folks, never used the instrument in worship. Well, that's a historical fact. We know that. And it was introduced some centuries later because somebody wanted it. That's really all it boils down to. And that's the reason why we have it today. You know, recently, just this past week, I read an article about the Hunter Hills Church in Alabama that is instituting the instrument in their worship. They're going to have a separate service. And you've read many articles like that recently. That's not a shock anymore. Many churches, many congregations of the Lord's church are going this route and introducing instrumental worship services. But I always like to read the reasoning. And I wish just once somebody put, we're going to instrumental music service because we want to. Because that's really all it boils down to. There is no scriptural authority to do it. Yet, even in this article, they were trying to give some scriptural means for doing so. Said they don't want to be legalistic any longer. Well, it's not legalistic to follow the Bible, right? It's not legalistic to do what the Bible authorizes or to stay away from what it doesn't authorize. We can become legalistic, but just following the Bible precepts doesn't make you legalistic. I wish just once somebody would say, yeah, we're going to have the instrument because we want it. At least that would be honest, right? That's the reason why we have the instrument in worship today. But we know that before we participate in any act of worship, we have to have the authority for it. Where is the authority for using the instrument in worship? We know the first church couldn't find that authority, and so they stayed away from it. We know that many scholars and theologians who are not quote-unquote Church of Christ couldn't find that authority. We know many founders of other denominations couldn't find that authority. So where does that authority come from? Well, it's not to be found, and so therefore you have to make a judgment based on your own personal preference, and that's what many have done. Tonight I want us to look at some of the arguments that are offered when it comes to the instrument in worship, and I think this is not necessarily to give us ammunition so that we can go out there and refute those who teach against what we believe. I think some people within our own body, not just at Oldham Lane, but across America, maybe across the world in churches of Christ, don't necessarily understand why we hold to the teaching, the biblical teaching of a cappella singing. And I think it's important that we know why we practice what we proclaim. And so let's look at some of the major arguments that are out there. One of the ones that always baffles me, but is brought up so often, is because instrumental music was authorized in the Old Testament, therefore it can be used in the New Testament. I mean, first of all, you're not a Jew, folks, okay? So let's just get that out of the way. You're not under the Old Covenant, so let's get that out of the way as well. But do you know, in order to be pleasing to God under the Old Testament system of worship, there were a lot of things you had to do besides playing an instrument. You realize that, don't you? Are we prepared to do everything that is prescribed in Old Testament worship in the New Testament church? Why is it that we want to just take the instrument and let that be the one thing we rest on? Because if you're going to attempt to be pleasing to God by taking what was done in the Old Testament and transferring it to the New Testament, you got to take it all. And there were animal sacrifices. Every male had to make a pilgrimage. Are we willing to do all of those things? I think not. Obviously, we want what satisfies us for the moment. We see in 2 Chronicles 29, verses 25 through 28, a description of Hezekiah's animal sacrifices upon the cleansing of the temple. I want you to notice what it states. He then stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, with harps, and with lyres, according to the command of David and of Gad the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet, for the command was from the Lord through his prophets. The Levites stood with the musical instruments of David, and the priests with the trumpets. Then Hezekiah gave the order to offer the burnt offering on the altar. When the burnt offering began, the song to the Lord also began with the trumpets, accompanied by the instruments of David, king of Israel. While the whole assembly worshiped, the singers also sang, and the trumpets sounded. And all this continued until the burnt offering was finished. There is no denying that instrumental music was very much a part of temple worship, was sanctioned by God. Does that give us right and reason to use it today in New Testament worship? Absolutely not. This worship was very different from the worship in the New Testament church. The very fact that we see under the New Covenant and New Testament worship that the instrument is not used should be very telling to us. Why is it that God commanded, allowed it in the Old Testament and that he doesn't today? Well, there's many theories that have been offered on that, but it seems as though that when animal sacrifices went out, so did the instrument. Charles Spurgeon said that it was childish at the time, that Israel was childish in its ways and in its thinking, and so God accommodated for that. We see that polygamy was also allowed, and obviously is not today. And why is that? Many people believe because of their childishness, because of their immaturity. But we cannot use the Old Testament as our pattern for New Testament worship because of the things that I just said a moment ago, but also because we are under a new system. The only question that we need to be answering is what is prescribed in New Testament worship. That's all that should matter to us, right? Because that is what we are living under in this day and age. When I was doing a series on instrumental music about 3 or 4 years ago, I sat down with Dr. Everett Ferguson, and he wrote one of the best books ever on this subject. And in this book, he states, instrumental music, therefore, was an important feature of temple worship, and it was closely associated with its sacrificial system. Here may be the significant clue explaining the absence of instrumental music in early Christian worship. Early Christianity saw the sacrificial system and temple worship as superseded by the sacrifice of Christ and the worship of the church. When the Levitical priesthood and the sacrificial cults were abolished, naturally its accompaniments were too. And so the end of animal sacrifices and the priestly class associated with temple worship brought about a change in New Testament worship. We also know that temple worship was external by nature. It was very external in its ceremony. Temple worship was more carnal in nature and featured numerous material elements that were to be replaced by a more spiritual system of worship. But what we have to understand is very simply, we do not live under that regime. We need to understand what worship means for us as New Testament Christians and not pick and choose from the Old Testament what we like and discard the rest. A second argument that is often raised is that because the instrument is mentioned in heaven, therefore it can be utilized in worship in the church today. Of course, there are some passages in Revelation that are used as the proof text here. Revelation 5, 8, and 9, Revelation 14, 2 and 3, Revelation 15, 2 and 3. And we won't read all those, but we have to understand that to make mention of instruments found in the book of Revelation and use that as authority for using the instrument in worship today is about as off base as the first argument we talked about in picking things from the Old Testament. First of all, instruments were never played in Revelation. Okay, those three passages that we look at never says that they were played. It says I heard the sound of a trumpet or they were holding a harp. Never says they were played, so let's get that technicality out of the way. But secondly, we know that Revelation is apocalyptic literature. In fact, the word revelation is the Greek word apokalypsis, and it means non-literal or figurative. You can't make this literal and still be upholding the integrity of the book. This is not literal. This is figurative, and we have to understand that. There are many symbols that are used in Revelation. I mean, Jesus is spoke of as a lamb slain. Was he truly a slain lamb? No. The churches are spoke of as lampstands. And you remember the letters to the 7 churches of Asia, that they're going to remove your lampstand. Church is not a literal lampstand. We understand that. People are not literally waters, or waters are not literally people. There is figurative language being spoken about here. Plus the fact that if we're going to use instruments in the New Testament as being our reason or authority for using them in worship today, can the reverse be true? If what is done in heaven should be done in worship on earth, can the reverse be true? I mean, when we get to heaven, are we going to contribute financially? Are we going to do different things that we do here in the worship of God when we're in heaven? You see the problems that this causes. And so therefore, we can't use this as authority for using the instrument in worship today. A third justification that is often made for the use of instrument in worship is, and one that really sounds pretty reasonable to the common person and even justifiable to some degree, and that is, if God has given me this ability, then why shouldn't I use it for Him? If I have the God-given ability to play the guitar or some other instrument, why would He be opposed to me using it in worship of Him? Do you remember when Paul spoke about spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians chapter 14? You remember there that Paul talks about those who had the gift of speaking in tongues. They weren't to use that gift in any way they chose, right? Any format that they chose. They were to have an interpreter. They were not able to just take these spiritual gifts and just fly off at the mouth and do whatever they wanted. There were regulations, there were restrictions on what they could do. Of course, you get into a kind of a dicey area when you talk about a God-given ability. I mean, we can label a lot of things a God-given ability that maybe not necessarily are so. This is the church where Colt McCoy grew up. Colt McCoy is quite an accomplished football player. He's in the NFL. His God-given ability, we might say, is to throw touchdown passes. So why not have him come up and throw a touchdown pass during worship to show his God-given ability? You see how ridiculous that can be after a while. You know, we've got some football players over here in our youth group. I'm sure that they'd be willing to come up and show their God-given ability as they tackle James McCoy or Barry Williams to show that they have this God-given ability and they're good at it, right? That is their act of worship. My friends, it gets to be ridiculous when we talk about that. We have to understand that while we may have an ability that we perceive as God-given, it doesn't supersede authority. It doesn't override authority. We must abide by biblical authority, not by what we want to do or what we perceive as a God-given ability. You know, I find it interesting that in Isaiah, he described the skill of those in his day who went to great lengths to design and craft an idol. He says, like the beauty of man. But this prophet, Isaiah, rebuked those who did such foolish things and stated that they lacked knowledge and understanding. Just because they could craft a beautiful idol didn't mean that they had some God-given ability or that they should even use it for that, right? We know that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down to that beautifully crafted golden image that was 10 stories high, but the artisans of Mesopotamia at that time were not praised and lauded for their God-given ability, right? In fact, if they had a God-given ability of being an artist, they certainly weren't using it in the right way. Another very common reason for employing the instrument in worship is the belief that if my attitude is right, then my actions can't be wrong. And so many times we see this in churches today. As long as I'm sincere, it must be okay. My friends, sincerity cannot be the driving force in what we do in worship. Is sincerity vital? Absolutely, without question. Is it the only prerequisite to God-pleasing worship? Absolutely not. Jesus told the woman at the well in John 4:24 that we are to worship in spirit and in truth. Obviously, that denotes a standard. We have a standard for how we are to worship. And it's not just sincerity. It's with the right attitude, the right heart, and by the right standard. As we've said so many times already in this series, God establishes what worship is acceptable to Him, not us. Doesn't matter how sincere we are, worship can be useless, it can be in vain, it can be worthless. Only worship that is done in accordance to God's will is acceptable worship. We know that Paul was sincere, even as he was persecuting Christians. We know that Uzzah was sincere. Saul was sincere. Worship of our Lord must be done with the right attitude, in reverence, in fear, with humility, with sincerity, but that's not the only driving force. The right attitude will always seek to do things according to God's will and not our own. Worship is regulated. Whether we want to admit that or not, it is, and we must abide by those regulations. We're going to talk a little bit later in this series about the difference between an aid and an addition. But it seems that a lot of folks get hung up there. If the instrument is not authorized in worship, then where do we find the authority for a microphone or for a PowerPoint presentation or for songbooks? Well, that's where we understand the difference between an aid and an addition. You know, a common example would be someone who uses a cane to help them walk. You know, that you're still walking, you're just using an aid to help you walk. But if you start riding a motorcycle, you've changed the mode of transportation, right? You're no longer walking, you're riding. And the same is true when it comes to the difference between an aid and an addition. A microphone doesn't change worship. It amplifies your voice so you can be heard. But when I walk away from that microphone, it doesn't do anything. It doesn't change worship. A songbook doesn't change worship. A PowerPoint presentation, I guess, could, depending on how it's used, but it doesn't change worship. A pitch pipe doesn't change worship. But adding something that is not authorized changes worship. It alters worship from what God has specified as being acceptable to Him. And we'll talk more of that at a later date, but that's one that we seem to get hung up on sometimes. We also need to understand that in Ephesians 5:19, that is a one another passage. Singing to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. Because it's a one another passage, we look at that word for sing. It's the Greek word psallo, and we're going to talk about that more at a later time as well, so I don't want to give too much away. But some want to use the old rendering of that word, and if you look at that word over time, there was a point in history when the word psallo could actually take on the meaning of singing with the accompaniment of plucking an instrument, right? But over time, it changed, as well as many words that we even use in our language change. And now if you were to ask someone who is well-versed in Greek, you ask them what the word psallo means, they would tell you it means to sing. And we know what it means in the New Testament. That's all that should matter for us, is what does it mean as it pertains to New Testament worship and New Testament Christians, and it means to sing. But even if we want to use that word in its old rendering to justify worshiping with the instrument today, in this day and age in the New Testament church, those who want to employ it are still in error. You realize that, right? Because it says from the old rendering that it is to pluck, right? So you can't play a piano in worship. You're not plucking an instrument. You have to use an instrument that you can pluck, right? Drums won't work. If you want to operate under the authority of God, and you want to say that psallo, which the old rendering could mean to pluck, so therefore I've got to use an instrument that can be plucked. And not only that, every one of us has to use it. Every one of us has to be plucking an instrument, because that is a one another passage. You can't deny that. That is very definitely a one another passage. So if we're not all plucking an instrument, whether it be a guitar, ukulele, whatever, we are all in error. So even that argument doesn't stand when you carry it out to its logical end. Some people would say, what's it all matter anyway? Isn't this a trivial matter? I mean, is God really going to send me to hell for playing an instrument in worship? Well, you cannot deny this. You cannot deny that there were errors in worship throughout the Bible that received strong rebuke from God, even death in some instances. Is worship important to God? Absolutely. You better believe it. Just ask Nadab and Abihu. It was important. And God expected it to be done according to His will and not our own. And so it does matter. You can't deny that. And it's important for us to understand what worship is regulated by God, what worship is authorized by God, and understand that it's His way and not ours. I think too often in the church today, not just in the denominational world, within the church, we can be very selfish. We want what we want, when we want it. We want things to cater to us. And once we have taken on that mentality, we have completely lost sight of what it should be about. This is not about you. It's not about me. Worship is not about me. Will I gain something from true worship? Absolutely. I should be changed by true worship. But true worship, biblical worship, is not about me. It's about God, the author of it, the one who sets the guidelines and expects it to be done according to His will. And if we truly want to please Him, then we're going to do it according to His will and not seek some selfish standard that makes us happy. This is not about what I feel or what I would like or what I think would be pleasing and bring in the numbers. This is about what God has authorized. And what God has authorized leaves us with no other alternative but to follow. That is our responsibility. As we've said throughout this year, we want to be followers, then we have to understand the relationship. We're not the master. No, we're the slave. Worship does matter to God. And because it matters to God, it better matter to us as well. Now, I hope this answers some questions. If it doesn't, stay with me, because over the next few weeks, we're going to look at more in depth why we sing. We're going to look at some of these other things that we talked about tonight, like the aid versus an addition, the word solo, and maybe get some more clarity on why we practice a cappella singing. You know, I went to a church website the other day, and there's Church of Christ there in Missouri, and it was talking about what they believe and why. And one of the things that it said is that, you know, we maintain a tradition of a cappella singing. This isn't a tradition, folks. This is about what the Bible authorizes. It may be a tradition in that we have kept it through the years, but we don't do this strictly because of tradition. We do this because it is authorized by God that we sing and make melody in our hearts. The instrument that we use is the heart. If you're sitting here tonight and you need the prayers and support of this church family, we'd love to pray with you. If you're not a child of God and you'd like to put on Christ in baptism, we'd love to do that as well. It's been a good day together. I pray that you have a great week, and I pray that you take your light out into the world and that you shine it brightly so that others may see your works and glorify the Father who is in heaven. If you have a need tonight, come now as we stand and as we sing.